isn't exactly how it happens.
You see, most movies don't have a faithful adaptation, and while The Shining is hailed as one of the greatest horror movies of all time, Stephen King, the author of the novel, criticizes it for being an unfaithful adaptation.
But we're not here to compare the two. We're going to look deeper into the novel itself, exploring key themes expressed in the characters, and hopefully, you'll start to look at the story more thoughtfully.
First, we'll give you some context about the author, then a story summary, and then we'll talk about how Stephen King unconsciously expresses himself through the characters of the story.
I'll follow that, talking about how the nature of humanity is expressed through these characters, and then we'll conclude and do a short recap.
Well, let's get it. I'm Sunny.
And I'm Jude.
And this is our English ISU project. Alright. Stephen King is widely regarded as the greatest modern horror author, dubbed the King of Horror. He has written over 60 books and around 200 short stories, many of which are considered some of the greatest horror books, such as The Shining, Carrie, Pet Sematary, and It. He published The Shining in 1977 while high on drugs and drunk, like he did the rest of his books until 10 years later. Now, he is 77 years old, living with his wife, and he has 3 kids.
The Shining takes place in Boulder, Colorado, in the mid-1970s, when Jack Torrance is hired as a winter caretaker for an isolated hotel called the Overlook. Even before Jack gets the job, there's a hint that something's wrong, as the year prior, the previous winter caretaker murdered his 2 daughters, his wife, and himself after going crazy. Despite this warning, Jack moves in that fall with his wife, Wendy, and his son, Danny, who has the ability to read minds and have visions. Before they enter the hotel, Danny has a terrifying vision of a familiar person hunting him through the hallways of the hotel with a blood and hair covered mouth.
As the family moves into the hotel, we are introduced to Halloran, the chef at the hotel, who before leaving for Florida, reveals that he has the same power as Danny, called the Shining. He becomes friends with Danny and explains that his power to see the future isn't guaranteed to happen, and there's something wrong with the hotel. He warns him to be careful and stay away from certain parts of the hotel, as well as to call for his help with telepathy if there is danger.
As the book continues, more is revealed about our main characters. Jack is a former alcoholic, much like the previous caretaker, a struggling writer, and someone in desperate need of a fresh start.
Wendy is introduced as a worrying and traditional wife, is protective of Danny, and tries to stay optimistic about Jack's new opportunity at the Overlook. However, inside, she's secretly scared of Jack. His temper had once led him to break Danny's arm before, and he's never really forgiven him.
As winter starts to set in, the hotel's true nature begins to reveal itself through strange supernatural events, such as a wasp nest that seems to magically refill itself to attack Danny, hedge animals that slowly move toward our main characters when they aren't looking, an undead lady in room 217, and much more. Unfortunately, it seems that Danny's strong shining power is what's activating the Overlook's stored up evil, as the hotel is trying to kill him to take his ability.
Eventually, Jack becomes fascinated with the hotel's violent and evil past. He unknowingly becomes to be influenced by the hotel. His old habits from back when he was an alcoholic start to return, despite a lack of alcohol in the building. Eventually, he becomes fully consumed by the Overlook, which preyed on Jack's insecurities, anger problems, and alcohol addiction, until he went insane. The Overlook Hotel's ghosts encourage him to earn his place at the hotel, and all he has to do is kill his wife and son. Jack eventually agrees and becomes a vessel of the hotel.
As Jack starts becoming more and more dangerous, Danny calls for Halloran for help, using his telepathy, urging him to make the journey from Florida to Colorado. Eventually, Jack snaps, trying to kill them. Despite being much stronger, he fails when Danny remembers that the boiler in the basement will explode without being checked on, killing the hotel and everybody in it. The Overlook tries to stop it in vain as it explodes, killing Jack and the hotel, while Danny, Wendy, and Halloran escape.
The story ends with Danny and Wendy trying to rebuild their lives and put their traumatic experience behind them. Now that we've seen the full story of The Shining, I want to focus on something a little more specific, how Jack is actually an unconscious self-insert of Stephen King himself. Many of Jack's struggles, such as with his family, teaching job, and especially being a writer struggling with alcoholism, mirror what King himself was facing when he wrote the novel, a little too close to be a coincidence. Much like Jack Torrance, who had been an alcoholic ever since sophomore class night in high school when he had taken his first drink,
King picked up his first drink during the 1960s in his senior year of high school. While Jack was deeply ashamed of his drinking problem in the beginning, as whenever he thought of the effect alcohol had on his family, self-loathing would back up his throat in a bitter wave. On the contrary, King spent the first 12 years or so of his married life assuring himself that he just liked to drink, and was even terrified that if he stopped using these substances, he would be left without the rocket fuel he needed to be propelled towards his success as a writer. This connection between drug use and writing is mirrored in Jack, who states that his mind felt sharp and accurate only when the writing was going extremely well or when he had a 3-drink buzz on. King's fear that continuing to drink alcohol and take drugs was the only way to continue writing turned out to be false, as he was able to rediscover the inner voice that shaped his fiction after quitting. On the other hand, Jack's alcoholism is both the result and cause of his writer's block, as the alcohol problem only gets worse when the writing he considers to be his real work was going badly. Most significantly for both writers, substance abuse is most impactful to their families. Jack breaking Janny's arm in an alcohol-induced stupor is a symbol of the rift that alcohol puts on their family, while King found himself unable to deny the startling reality that his addictions were beginning to wreak serious havoc on the world around him. However, what separates King and his character is that in the end, King was able to quit the alcohol and hard drugs after being offered an ultimatum by his family and friends. He would no longer be able to live in the same house with his wife and children while continuing to drink and drug. While King was able to recognize that his alcoholism was a problem, take advice from his family, and stop his addictions altogether, Jack falls short in all these aspects. He fails to take responsibility for the harm that has come onto his family. Notably, breaking Danny's arm, which he profusely claims to be an accident, even though inside he knows it wasn't. By claiming the incident was an accident instead of a direct consequence of his drinking and anger problem, he's excusing his actions, as well as not recognizing his drinking as a serious enough problem. Jack's willful ignorance is also symbolized through his denial of supernatural events that occur throughout the hotel. He lies that there wasn't anything in room 217, saying, "Nothing here, not a thing," and also denies that anything in the hotel was going on at all. This lie that there isn't a problem is an unconscious parallel to how King, at the time of writing The Shining, continued to make excuse after excuse for why he needs to continue consuming alcohol and drugs. He denied there was a problem until he couldn't anymore. However, in the end, while King ended up putting his family over his addictions by quitting, Jack Torrance is basically a representation, a symbol, a foreshadowing of King's parallel self which has never come into being. In short, what Stephen King could have turned into if he never stopped his abuse of alcohol. As Dustin Cahood puts it, he wrote The Shining without even realizing until years later that he had been writing about himself, and it was through the story's main protagonist, Jack Torrance, that King voiced his first cries for help as an addict. King from the very beginning was deeply ashamed of his drinking problem, just like Jack was. He just convinced himself he needed it and ignored the signs. This shows how unconsciously authors write themselves into their work. Jack Torrance wasn't intentionally designed to be a self-portrait, but King's inner and hidden conflicts, such as his fear of failing as a writer, hurting his family, and losing control naturally bled into The Shining. They reveal their truest selves not through confession, instead through their stories and characters. Through Jack, Stephen King unknowingly wrote both a warning to what he could become and his path to redemption.
While the characters in The Shining did end up showing King's own traits, I think that the main trio of Jack, Wendy, and Danny can help us understand the nature of humanity as a whole, and how it can change due to conditions either influenced by past decisions or events, present conditions that threaten your life, or even situations that don't require you to change, but it would be beneficial for you to adapt. Human nature, defined by Google using Oxford Languages, is the general psychological characteristics, feelings, and behavioral traits of humankind, regarded as shared by all humans. Jack Torrance starts off as a good husband and father. We are introduced to him as a bright, sympathetic man with literary ambitions. He cares about Wendy, supporting her through her tense relationship with her mother. In the book, Wendy had finally managed to break from her mother. Jack had helped her. He had also had a great relationship with Danny, Wendy noting that while Danny loved his mother, he was his father's boy. However, his nature starts to turn evil, both before the story and throughout their stay at the hotel. While recalling a past incident of his father physically abusing his mother, Jack remembers the incident with horror and revulsion, but when he revisits the episode much later in the novel, he can see how necessary that beating had been. 20 years later, he could finally appreciate Daddy's wisdom. His alcoholism also plays a role, as one night he hadn't been home until 4 in the morning, stumbling and mumbling his way up the stairs, waking Danny up when he came in. He had tried to soothe the baby and dropped him on the floor. In the end, he was turned into a savage vessel, a puppet of the hotel. By the end of the novel, when he attempts to murder his son with a mallet, Jack has wholly submitted to evil. The three dark forces that haunt Jack, his own destructive dispositions, the legacy of his father, and the evil of the Overlook have come together in this mallet-wielding monster. Everything has disappeared from who Jack is supposed to be. Before he goes after Wendy and Danny, he hears the voice of the hotel telling him to keep his promise, which he agrees to, and he heard the fawning servility in his own voice, but was unable to control it. Jack ultimately succumbed to the promises of power, and this is a normal human trap that many people tend to fall to. Wendy starts the story as meek and not a very strong character. She bends more or less to Jack's desires, responding to Danny about staying in the hotel. If it's what your father wants, it's what I want. This is partly due to her relationship with her mother. One article notes that Wendy's mother abuses Wendy to cope with her own inability to fulfill her role as the nuclear wife. She kicks Wendy out of the house while Wendy is in college because she thinks Wendy is responsible for her divorce. In the novel, Wendy's mother never said anything overtly, but the message came through anyway. The price she had begun to pay for the reconciliation with her mother was the feeling that she was an inadequate mother. Eventually, she is forced to overcome her natural human nature in a confrontation with Jack. She eventually realizes that she can't protect him anymore, and as such, Wendy's attempt to murder Jack demonstrates how she understands that he is a real and permanent threat to her and Danny's safety. When explaining to Danny what is going on, her voice was low and husky. Listen to me, Danny. I didn't want to hurt him. Do you understand me? Wendy seems to represent the people who are generally looked upon as followers, those who would lay down in the face of adversity. But this changes that view as she takes charge and starts becoming a mother worried with protecting her child and not herself. Her saying to Danny, I didn't want to hurt him, do you understand me? Both takes her past, which she doesn't want to hurt him because he's her husband, but also recognizing the present reality that if she hadn't, they'd be dead. Danny starts off the story as a young child who doesn't know what to do. He's only 5 years old after all. While he does eventually grow up, to his parents, he's still a 5-year-old son whose opinion is not equal to the judgment of the adults. Therefore, his visions of the gruesome future are not taken seriously, and he's trapped in the Overlook against his will. When talking to the doctor about his visions, he says, I can't remember, I could tell you if I could. He feels like too young to do anything, and naturally feels overwhelmed at everything that goes on around him in the story. Danny's human nature is affected by his shine, special powers that allow him to use telepathy, have visions, and read emotions. Talking to Halloran, he says, but I don't understand things. I do, but I don't. People, they feel things, and I feel them, but I don't know what I'm feeling. It's also noted that Danny's ability to shine determines his destiny. He does not quite understand his visions, but he does sense the malevolence of their meeting, and is from the beginning reluctant about going about the hotel. In the end of the story, he ultimately grows up a little bit, feeling that for the first time in his life, he had an adult thought, an adult feeling. Unfortunately, this thought was, Mommy and Daddy can't help me, and I'm alone. Danny could have panicked and done little kid things, and if he had, I wouldn't blame him. He's only 5 after all. It's natural that when young kids feel overwhelmed, they tend to break down and cry on the floor. but he grew up a little bit, and that will change his human nature. In conclusion, we can tangibly see human nature in all these characters and how they can change. Jack was affected by his past and ultimately succumbed to evil. Wendy was forced to change due to her circumstances, but Danny changed as a result of the choice he had at a moment of indecision. All these three outcomes can happen in our lives as well. P.S. However, it's important to remember that while these are human characters based off of real humans and real human traits, this doesn't mean that every father with a rough past is going to start going insane. While we can see general humanity expressed through these characters and their traits, all people are different, and these examples will not apply to every single human.
So after looking at the whole story, the themes, the characters, and its significance to the author, it's pretty safe to say that The Shining is so much more than just a horror novel. It's a study of people, and how addictions, fear, and tough times can shape who we are and what we become.
Yeah, it's not just something that you can read for a bit of a scare. It's also a reflection of human nature as a whole and all of its complexities. Through Jack, King shows that many humans are tempted with promises of power and advancing through the workplace. Through Wendy, King shows people who may seem weak are actually able to stand up for themselves and others. And through Danny, King communicates that even kids can change their nature and grow up even when their natural instinct is to have an emotional outbreak.
What makes this novel so powerful isn't just because it's a little scary, but also how personal it is. King, without knowing, wrote himself into the story, which is what makes the story feel so real.
It's not just Jack or King losing himself and going insane in that hotel. It's how easily anyone could. Thus, through King's work on The Shining, we can also get a glimpse of not just him, but humanity's nature as a whole, which is what great writing does.
So here's a call to action for you. Addiction isn't just a simple flaw, but it's something that can destroy lives and harm people around them, like what happens with Jack and Stephen King. However, what saves people from it is the support from the people around them. So Stephen King's family and friends, with their intervention, helped stop his downward spiral into what Jack became. Conversely, Jack is a cautionary tale of the consequences of hiding his inner feelings and when family doesn't take enough measures to help. If you're struggling with an issue, then it's imperative that you talk to someone and not keep it hidden like Jack does. And if you see a family member who doesn't seem quite themselves, family support is vital for recovery.
So, if we were to wrap it all up in a nice little bow, it would be that you shouldn't push others away like Jack did with his wife and son. Other people want to help you when they see you struggling, and that is something that I believe all other humans would agree with.
That wraps it up pretty nicely. Once again, I'm Sunny.
And I'm Jude.
And thanks for watching our English ISU on The Shining by Stephen King.